In foreign trade, modes of delivery determine not only how the product is shipped, but also who takes responsibility when and at what point the risk passes to whom. With Ex-Works and FCA behind us, it's time for a delivery method that means less burden for the buyer and more control for the seller. CPT, Carriage Paid To, which means carriage paid for. CPT means that the seller delivers the goods by paying the cost of transportation to an agreed destination. But beware, even if carriage is paid for, the risk passes to the buyer as soon as the goods are delivered to the first carrier. In other words, the seller gives the goods to the carrier he has organized, pays for the transport, but if there is damage en route, the buyer is responsible. This distinction is very important. The seller bears the cost, the buyer bears the risk. The basic logic of CPT is that the seller takes on the initial part of the logistics process. The seller does the export customs clearance, delivers the product to the carrier, and pays the freight. However, after this point, any damage or loss of the product is the responsibility of the buyer. Insurance is not mandatory, so it is recommended that the buyer insures the product throughout the transportation process. CPT is compatible with all modes of transportation: air, land, sea, train. This makes it particularly useful in multinational and mixed transportation trade. Let's clarify with an example. Let's say an exporter in Istanbul sells a product to a customer in Moscow. Under CPT Moscow terms, the seller delivers the product to the carrier, for example, a trucking company. He also pays for the transportation to Moscow. However, if the product is damaged on the way to the Turkish border because the risk is transferred to the buyer upon delivery to the carrier, the buyer is responsible for this damage. So the freight may have been paid, but there is no guarantee. This difference is often misunderstood. This is the main difference between CPT and FCA. In FCA, the seller simply delivers to the carrier and the costs are passed on to the buyer. In CPT, the seller pays for the transportation, but remember, who bears the cost and who bears the risk are two different things. CPT is one of the forms of delivery that most clearly demonstrates this difference. To summarize, CPT is a form of delivery where the seller bears the logistics cost, but the risk passes to the buyer early on. Delivery and destination should be clearly specified in the contracts, and the choice of carrier should be meticulous. In the next video, we will discuss CIP, carriage, and insurance paid to, the insured version of this mode of delivery. Stay tuned to manage control and risk well in foreign trade.